And Mimi, you will.
Sorry, Reggie, what did you say?
You will mute everybody.
Yes, I will mute everybody. Okay, it is just 6. I know I can see that people are still joining the meeting, so I'm going to wait a minute or two before we start in on that, before I start in on my opening remarks. Just give everybody a chance to get into the session. Okay, it looks like we've, people may still dribble in, but it looks like we've got the people who were in the waiting room. So I'm going to get us started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Mimi Coulter. I'm the past chair of IFLA's Academic and Research Libraries Committee. It's my privilege to host you all here today for this webinar that our committee is sponsoring. I want to start with thank yous on the administrative end. Thank you to Reggie Raju, who has taken a lead role in coordinating our webinar program for the committee. He was really instrumental in bringing this panel together today. So thanks very much, Reggie, for all of your work. Similarly, I want to thank Xin Li. She's also here. Reggie and Xin are both here on the panel with me. Xin has also done a lot of work coordinating, has dealt with a number of the technology issues on getting this webinar set up, coordinated with IFLA HQ, and has has been really helpful in keeping this program moving. Thank you very much to Xin. And last but not least, thanks to Gulson Cribb, and also to our communications coordinator, Jayshree Mamtora, who's been helping us keep things on track and keep everybody informed of the program. Our topic today, a really interesting one, is decolonization in education. It's one that, from my North American perspective and from my US perspective, is one that has been of very much increased interest of late, certainly in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the sort of growth of the Black Lives Matter movement that came after that. I know certainly in my own institution, we are taking a new look at our collections, looking at our classification systems within the libraries and thinking about decolonization, thinking thinking more broadly as well, but the collections are a particular focus. I know we're not alone in that effort, and I certainly know that there's more that we could be doing. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion that I think we can have today on that front. So first, let me move on to introductions, and I am very sorry to have to announce that we only have 2 speakers for you today instead of 3. Unfortunately, Camille Callison is unexpectedly unable to join us, and we wish her well and apologies. We do have Stacey Allison Casson. Stacey is a member of the Métis Nation of Ontario. She is an associate librarian in the Department of Student Learning and Academic Success at York University in Toronto, in Canada. She is currently chair of the Canadian Federation of Library Associations Indigenous Matters Committee. She also sits on the IFLA Indigenous Matters Committee. She's a strong advocate for open access, for open bibliographic data, and for Indigenous data sovereignty. She's an active member of Wikimedia projects, and she's the lead on the IFLA Wikidata Working Group. So welcome, Stacey. We're really happy to have her here with us today. Also on our panel, we have Richard Higgs. Richard is a lecturer in digital curation and library and information studies in the Department of Knowledge and Information Stewardship at the University of Cape Town. He holds a master's in creative writing from UCT and also a Master of Letters from UPV Montpellier. He is currently working on his PhD on the topic of digital representations of the so-called Hottentot Venus. We can ask him later what that is. And he also has research interests including decolonial ontologies, epistemology, and also online teaching and learning, which are very relevant these days. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to the speakers in just a moment, but I want to quickly cover administrative issues. You will see in our Zoom presentation today that you have options for both Q&A and for chat. I am going to be looking at both, but I ask that if you have questions for the panelists that you use the Q&A because it is much easier for me to monitor that. So please, I encourage you to use the Q&A for questions, and then you can use the chat function to talk to each other and to talk to, either to individuals or back and forth between each other. Please note that you'll have a little a drop-down menu there. You'll need to pull it down to say all panelists and attendees if you want all of the other attendees to see your message. If you just want to send something to us on the panel, you can just use the all panelists bit of drop down, and I'll give you a quick minute to look at the chat and play with that. And take a little time. It looks like a number of people have already made comments and said hello, which is great. Thank you, everybody. So glad to see that the chat is working that way. We are recording this message. You'll have gotten the alert when you logged on. So we will be posting the session to our IFLA ARL committee website once we've processed everything and gotten things back up. So if you miss anything, you can come back, learn more. Okay, those were my notes. I think with that, I am going to turn it over to our first speaker, who is Stacey Allison Casson. Welcome, Stacey.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm really, really happy to be joining you all today. I'm going to be talking while I'm trying to switch my slides and get them up. And let's go to view. Okay, so I hope everyone now is seeing my slides. So especially when talking about work in relation to Indigenous issues or decolonization, it's really important to center ourselves in that work. So I'll give you a little bit more information about myself in case you don't know. I will say just a shout out to some of the Canadians on this call. I did see some people in the chat, so I'm glad you're here with me today. I am a member of the Métis Nation of Ontario. For those who are not familiar with Métis peoples, They are an Indigenous nation separate from the First Nations people or the Inuit people in Canada, and originally coming from the people who were involved, typically men involved in the fur trade and First Nations women. And so my dad is Métis. My grandmother came from the Winnipeg area in Manitoba, which is on the prairies. I myself was born in Thunder Bay, Ontario, which is at the head of Lake Superior. This is a picture of me and my dad at Kekabeka Falls, just outside of Thunder Bay. And in the middle picture is a picture of my daughter holding sand from Lake Superior, which is again close to Thunder Bay, and where my family currently lives. I also have connections to the Georgian Bay Métis community and the Red River community. These are important sites in Canada for the Métis Nation. And so this work for me has a really strong personal connection, but it's also, I think, something to consider as it's not something I talked about originally in my early career as a librarian, because it's not, we don't always bring ourselves into our work or talk about our own identity in relation to work that we do in libraries. And so in some ways, this is part of sort of my mid-career phase, I would say. In my earlier career, I was a music cataloger for a long time. I've also done work in digital humanities, so I have a strong connection to metadata work, but currently I'm in the teaching and learning department at York University. And often in Canada, when we give presentations, we give a land acknowledgement to acknowledge the place where we are. And of course, when we're meeting on a virtual space, it is a challenge to think about what it means when we talk about land. But again, when we talk about Indigenous work, when we talk about decolonization, which means we're talking about the impacts of colonization. And so it is important for all of us maybe to take some time to think about the land that we're occupying, the land that we live on, that we are from, and how relationships with that space shapes us, and how we think about the history of occupation of that land, and maybe the ways that the land that we occupy is contested, because we know as well, and I'll talk a little bit about this through this talk, that you know, information I like to talk about as being relational. And so when we talk about knowledge as well, it is all the things, it's not just something we read in a book, but all the things we encounter in our lives, including the land that we live on or move throughout. So I'm just inviting you to take some time to think about where you are. And also as we meet in this virtual space, you know, all of the ability for us to meet has to do with hardware, with servers, with cables, and all of those pieces of technology also move through land. So when we think about our library spaces or our virtual spaces, it is thinking about that relationality of all of the things that we work through. And so through this talk, if we can consider that, I think that's really important or foundational to the way that we think. So what do we mean when we talk about decolonization? And again, it invites us or forces us, or should anyway, to think about, well, what is colonization? And certainly where I am in Canada, you know, colonization is about the removal of people from land to open it up for some sort of use, whether it's settlement, resource extraction. A colonizing body has come in and is attempting to remove or rights to land or to remove occupation in different ways. And in Canada, this took many forms. When we talk about, there is a specter of genocide when we talk about what it means to think about colonization. And in relation to libraries or information spaces, it's important to consider the way that genocide can be enacted through cultural genocide. So this is the removal of language, the removal of cultural practices. In Canada, this came about through also a government program of assimilation. So when I turned to thinking about my own family, my grandmother, for example, did not teach her language, which was French with a little bit of Ojibwe. Like I said, it did not teach that to her children because this was not something that was seen as being sort of lesser than English or lesser than what was desirable if you were not white or seen to be white. So what does it mean to decolonize? And it is recognizing original occupation. It's recognizing the rights of people to language and culture. And it also asks us to think about, and the reason I like this quote is to think about what does it mean for us and how do we think about this as people who are involved in organizations and universities, and does it mean that certain kinds of knowledges should be in our libraries? Again, colonization does have to do also with the taking away of objects or material culture from the people who lay claim to those things. So again, it brings about this question of how we understand knowledge in the context of library systems and what are the implications for university libraries. So in this talk today, I'm just going to go through a couple of different examples of different initiatives in Canadian university libraries that I'm aware of. As I said, or was said in my introduction, I'm currently the chair of the Canadian Federation of Library Associations Indigenous Matters Committee, and I did put a little call out to see if people had some initiatives to share, so that's what I'm sharing with you today. And this is a small sample of a lot of different kinds of work that's happening across Canada. I wanted to share first this initiative that was developed by Larissa McLeod, and it has to do with creating, or what work she has done is creating citation styles for being able to cite Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers according to standard citation styles like MLA or APA. And I'll just go back and forth here. So a reason why she calls it more than personal communication is that is what would have been required when you're using a citation style to cite an elder or knowledge keeper, but that doesn't quite capture the relationship or the respect that is due that piece of knowledge. So when we talk about what are the kinds of things we need to think about when we talk about respecting Indigenous knowledge in the context of universities or academic libraries, or when it comes to thinking about scholarship, it is giving equal footing to oral knowledge. We know that, I think probably for many of us on this call, we know that that is a huge issue that we have tended in universities and in libraries to foreground textual documents as holding knowledge above oral knowledge, or even, as I said, coming from a music background, that even other kinds of ways that we think about knowledge that are non-textual. And we know this is the way many of our cataloging standards are written, that they foreground textual knowledge. So being able to cite knowledge coming from elders or from knowledge keepers in a respectful way, giving weight to that knowledge, is a really important part of recognizing the importance of that knowledge. And so this work has been really important. You can see that this citation style is now used or linked by a great number of universities in Canada, as well as other places. And so again, not considering this kind of knowledge in our citation styles is a way that Indigenous or non-Western knowledge is made less visible and given less consideration. So when we think about ways that we decolonize or ways that we give respect to Indigenous knowledge, it is including things like citation styles. At York University, where I am in Toronto, I can't say we have done many initiatives, but I do want to just reference one initiative that took place over the past year, which was an Indigenous Research and Scholarship Learning Circle that I was involved in that came out of the Department of Open Scholarship. And this was a way for librarians and archivists at York University to think about the context of Indigenous researchers or Indigenous research in terms of services around open scholarship. And so the form that this initiative took was kind of a kickoff meeting where Ruth Colesar-Green, who is an Indigenous professor at York, gave a session for librarians and archivists. And then we had 3 meetings, in-person meetings, where we did sit in a circle and we had readings ahead of time that were delivered through Moodle, and really focusing on some discussion around the history of colonization in Canada, but also looking at that from an Indigenous perspective. And then what does that mean in the context of research and researchers, and how does that change the way we consider services, or how we think about openness in relation to Indigenous issues. And so we're actually coming up to our closing panel was delayed by the COVID closures. So actually that's going to be coming in October, and it will actually happen during Open Access Week, that we are going to have now online panel around Indigenous research. So that's one initiative that we've had. Something, as I already alluded to, was this, the implications of the removal of Indigenous languages. And this was done forcibly in places such as residential schools, through different assimilation tactics. And so one of the ways that we think about sort of restorative practices or thinking about decolonization is the recognition of the importance of Indigenous languages. And that can extend to a number of different kinds of initiatives. So at the University of Toronto, so last year was the Year of Indigenous Languages. And I'm just going to feature two initiatives that took place there. So one is through the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library, which was an open house where materials related to Indigenous languages that were in the collections were pulled and made available in different ways. And you know, I know that this is something at my institution, maybe at yours as well, that there may be materials that have to do with Indigenous languages or in Indigenous languages in your special collections somewhere in your library, but they may not be very accessible just because people may not know about them, or they're not brought into view in a particular way. So this bringing together materials this way allowed people to see them and to interact with them. And also in relation to this initiative, this welcome, I guess, sign was put up. And so this initiative also speaks to the ways that Indigenous languages can be recognized in our physical spaces. I do know that there are other initiatives in libraries in Canada which are focusing on signage as a way of also indicating that presence. So it's not like Indigenous people are gone from North America or gone from Canada. And so one of the ways that presence can be reinforced is through signage and language. And it is really important to be able to physically see those languages in library spaces. And something else I just want to touch on briefly, and I realize I'm sort of giving I feel like it's a whirlwind tour of a number of really complex topics. But we know that access to materials is key, and in order for communities to be able to access knowledge. And again, when we turn to looking at the impacts of colonization, renaming of places, of peoples, of cultures by colonizers is one of the ways that those original, for when it comes to places, that occupation is erased. And so there is a restoration of namings that is really important to this work. And also, again, as a step of redress. And I think as Mimi pointed out, that this is one of the areas that certainly in loss of quarters is quite active, is the working on headings. And so if you have not seen it, the Canadian Federation of Library Associations issued a Truth and Reconciliation Committee report and recommendations, which was in response to the larger Truth and Reconciliation commission that took place in Canada. And I really encourage you to check it out if you have not, because it specifically goes through a number of concrete actions that can be taken to move towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And so we know that in classification systems, in subject headings, that Indigenous sovereignty and worldviews are unrecognized. And this isn't specific to the country known as Canada. This goes for all kinds of nations. And so when we look, we know that every heading has an ideological bias that is just part of the way that it works, but we really need to address specific areas where terminology is racist, is sort of smoothing over original names, or making genocide invisible itself. So this is a really important area to consider. I'm just going to talk briefly about a couple of things. So one initiative happening through the Canadian Federation of Library Associations has been a project looking at the development of terminology, the First Nations, Métis and Inuit Indigenous ontology. I know some people on this call I saw have also been working on this project. So this has been an ongoing project for a number of years. It's been a way to address community names specifically. Because one of the challenges is most libraries in Canada, academic libraries especially, use the Library of Congress terms, which are not really appropriate when it comes to the Canadian Indigenous perspectives. And so trying to find an alternative is really important. For example, Indians of North America, we don't use Indians in Canada, we use First Nations, yet Indians of North America is the terminology that is in the Library of Congress. So working to change this terminology is a really important part of doing the work of decolonization. And again, I know that there are other libraries in Canada, like the University of Manitoba, University of British Columbia, and many other institutions have been working to make these changes. The digital realm also is another area where decolonization or indigenization is really key. I'm just going to point out, for those who may not be aware of indigitization coming out of the University of British Columbia, again, something to look at, looking at toolkits for how digitization work can take place, how to understand respectful approaches to digitization. So one of the things coming out of the open movement, when we think about Indigenous sovereignty, that's really important, is to understand just because something is in public domain or can be digitized doesn't mean it should be. If it contains materials that were collected under problematic circumstances, if it is materials that really should be treated with respect, that it's important to work with communities with whom that material is associated, or really taking some considerations. I know this is an issue when you have things like mass digitization projects, when everything in public domain is digitized, but it is a problem when you have materials, for example, that were collected by anthropologists in the turn of into the 20th century, like in the 19th century, and you have documentation of sacred dances, for example, and then those things are digitized in a mass digitization project, and then they are visible when really, according to the community practices, those things should not be viewable unless you're within that community. Also at the University of Alberta, and I'm very grateful to Anne Carwigan, who's at the University of Alberta, for providing me with some slides and some information. They have been working on a number of projects around digital spaces and recognizing contemporary Indigenous voices in terms of how contemporary experiences are documented and made visible. Digital Indigenous hubs, such as the University of Saskatchewan portal, are really great places to go to find more materials. And again, what's interesting, for example, of like the University of Saskatchewan portal is the way the materials are organized in order to better recognize Indigenous worldviews. So really taking a look at the ways that the information is organized itself and stepping back and recognizing that there is a different way of thinking about the world. And then I just wanted to close with thinking about how we grow the numbers of Indigenous library workers. I know in Canada, we do not have as many librarians and archivists who identify as Indigenous as I think we would, we would like to see doing this work. And so again, looking to the University of Alberta for some programs they have done and looking at the ways that relationship building is so important, and the ways that we can bring Indigenous peoples into the profession. And it is not necessarily going to be at the point of a job ad. If you have posted an ad and you want to bring somebody in who is Indigenous, but you haven't done that work previously, or you haven't thought about growing the profession previous to that, then it can become really challenging. And so the University of Alberta has a really amazing, I think, Indigenous internship program where they specifically support First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students at the University of Alberta Library and Information Studies program. And this program really allows students to not only get financial support, but actually work on library programming that has a personal connection to them. And this is a photo of just 3 of their recent interns. And it, in my view, it's a really fantastic way to give students the ability to gain work experience, to be supported, to build relationships within the libraries, but also to engage in work that is meaningful to them, which also then is helpful to the library itself, because you have really community focused and engaged work. So really a fantastic program. So that's the end of my, I feel like, as I said, my whirlwind tour of some initiatives in Canada. There are many, many, many more, and certainly there's lots of fantastic work taking place, but also lots more we could be doing. And I just want to quickly acknowledge a few of the people. Certainly, I certainly miss Camille Callison today, who has been a great mentor to me, and also to call out some of my colleagues who have provided me with some information about their initiatives. And I'm always extremely grateful to people for sharing their experiences and working on these issues. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think there is a little bit of time for questions.
There is, and we already have 3 questions in the Q&A, and those of you, please feel free to add more questions to the Q&A. Anybody on the call can jump in. Excuse me. So Judith Bailey asks, has there been an attempt not to use American in reference to First Nation peoples?
Yeah, so if you mean to use like American Indian, or yes, I think that there has been a number of initiatives in Canada to sort of decouple in some ways from terminology that's used in the United States, just in many ways because we just use different terminology. And so some of that, if you want to get technical about cataloging, some of that terminology has been changed at the local level. So going in and changing subject headings at institutions at the local level to something that is more in keeping with the usage in Canada. If that, so if I'm reading the question correctly.
I was reading it that way as well.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Let me move on to the next question. Jill Klassen from the UCT Libraries asks, is it possible to have a definition for decolonization that can be used across cultures?
Wow, so that's a very big question.
It is.
I think yes, in terms of we can understand colonization as a worldwide action, right? So colonization is not specific to Canada. It's also not in the past. We know, for example, in Canada, you can talk about an ongoing project of colonization, and we can look at many other places in the world where colonization is an ongoing and active process. And so, can I give you a worldwide sort of definition that works? I'm not sure I could do that right at the sort of the tip of my tongue, but I think absolutely we can think about programs that either or actions we personally can take or actions for our organizations that resist colonizations, that recognize colonization, recognize power dynamics sort of inherent in the act of colonization, and bring that to the work that we do. I was mentioning just before we got onto this call that I've been doing some other recording with the IFLA Wikidata group and having some conversations with librarians from across the world around what we're sort of terming knowledge equity and including places like Wales or communities in France or places that you might not think of as, we might not think of as obvious sites of colonization, but they are because of the ways that language or culture are actively being dominated. And so when you have those acts of power and domination, we have to try and resist that. So that's my best answer on that question, I think, right now.
I think you did. That is.
Oh yeah,
please do,
for sure.
Please do, Richard.
Yeah. Also, I would not, I don't think, be able to provide a universal definition, but I think that there's a core experience of colonization that I think Stacey very neatly kind of summed up in power relations, and looking at power relations as the foundation of that core. But I think individual experiences vary from country to country, or even from place to place. So it would be difficult, and some of the literature that I've encountered on decolonization is sort of come from a global Northwest perspective, where it speaks about majorities and minorities. And if you're in Africa or India, it's actually the opposite situation, where minorities have colonized majority populations, and where we are dealing with that not as a kind of opposite dynamic. So I think we need to be careful, and we need to be aware that experiences are different across the world, which is why I think Stacey's founding it on describing power relations, historical and contemporary power relations, is a very useful way of doing it.
And on that front, I will note that one of the, not so much a question in the Q&A, is a comment from Helen Amunga, who says, thank you for the insightful presentation. I would love to engage with you for more guidance on how to go about a related program in Kenya under UNESCO. So, clearly this is something that is of interest and across the globe. And yes, the dynamic is going to be, that power relation dynamic is going to be different in different places. So hopefully we can make that connection with Helen. I do. Go ahead,
so if I could
Stacey.
just, sorry, and so absolutely, I just wanted to thank Richard for jumping in there, because I think absolutely, I think that's, we have to resist sort of pan-Indigenous or I don't know, decolonizing approaches, because there isn't one Indigenous culture in Canada. There are many, many, and each are different. My experience, for example, is quite different from Camille's, and we can talk about the ways that colonization have impacted our stories in different ways. And so the approaches that you would take would be mindful of that. And I think that's the important part too, to think about what is the ways or the impacts of colonization on peoples and cultures in a myriad of different ways. And it is recognizing how, I'll just say, destructive colonization is to knowledge and cultures for peoples who have been decolonized, and that there does require thoughtfulness, and again, it's not going to be one approach to the issues that you're looking at, and except that we know that, again, colonization is about dominating in particularly destructive ways. So I'll stop there, but I do think it's important to say, yes, there is a commonality in some ways to colonization, but we have to then resist the desire to come up with a sort of blanket solutions or a blanket way to look at those problems.
So actually, the last question that we have right now in the Q&A is kind of related to this. Is there a list by country on what decolonization work in libraries has been, what decolonization in libraries has been started or worked on? Do you know of any coordinated effort?
I was looking at the question. Like, I don't know if there's a collected list. I mean, I'm just thinking about even in relation to the IFLA Indigenous Matters section. I know that there's certainly, and that has been for me, a really wonderful experience, actually working with Indigenous peoples from New Zealand or from India or from other places in the world where experiences are quite different. I mean, Indigenous peoples in Canada are a minority, and there are historic reasons why that is in North America. And so I'm not aware. If someone is, please share, because I'm not aware. And I know that there are, I feel like we need like a resource list, because I think there are some places you can go to see examples of that work in different countries. And again, it's looking at the context of that work.
Okay, very good. So thank you very much, Stacey. That was really helpful, and I think had some really good questions there as well. So thanks everybody for jumping in. I am going to turn things over to Richard at this point.
Sure. Thank you, Mimi. And I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully get it right this time. So that should be it.
Yes, that looks good.
Great, thank you. I chose to speak about something that is closely related to my research area, which is ontological inequities in the decolonial library. And just to start off, what ontological means is the way we construct knowledge and the way we describe knowledge. So as opposed to epistemology, which is asking questions about how we know things and different ways of knowing things, ontology being the way we describe we describe the world and the way that we describe the world. And very familiar to librarians who are involved in classification and taxonomy, that ontology is basically what you are doing when you are working with classification. That's just me. My Twitter handle is over there if you're interested in that. So starting from my starting point, looking at ontological injustice, and this image here was a photograph that I took in 2016 during the Fees Must Fall protests, which came after the Roads Must Fall protests in South Africa, which really triggered South African universities looking at decolonization and decoloniality. It was a very disruptive time, but very productive as well, in that it forced South African universities to look very closely at educational practices, not just in teaching, but in research and in libraries as well, that reinforce colonial injustices. And I love the way that Stacey introduced herself and sort of started off speaking about her position and where she's coming from and where she is, and respecting the land, because the University of Cape Town is built on land that was basically stolen by the British from the indigenous people who originally lived in this area and have been living in this area for hundreds of years. And not only that, but it has perpetuated a typically, or a kind of whiteness that it has inherited, where students of color who are attending the university feel that they are alienated, that they're excluded, that they are not welcome in this space. And so this graffiti, which has subsequently disappeared, been scrubbed off above the UCT library's sign, was to me very, very poignant. And it forced me to ask the question. I was lecturing at the time, convening and lecturing a course in library leadership and management. And it forced me to ask how this has come about. How is a university library a dehumanization zone? And it also gave me a unique opportunity to invite some of the protesters from Roads Must Fall and Fees Must Fall in to speak to the students and to address the students on what their experience was, but also to share with students what they feel a library could be and how a library could be better and better address the needs of non-English, non-white, non-English speaking and non-white students at the university. Moving on to ontological injustice, it's not a very common term in the literature. So I've come up with my own definition, which is the result of coercing or wedging texts and artifacts into taxonomies that are at best a poor fit, and at worst perform ontological violence on people and their narratives. And I've adapted this from the more common term of epistemic injustice, which Miranda Fricker describes as happening when an individual's knowledge is obscured from collective understanding as a result of structural inequities that marginalize or exclude certain groups from participating in shared meaning. So taking that as a background and looking at what the university library might look like if we're decolonizing, and what that means for education and LIS education in particular, I'd like to look fairly broadly at exclusion and how exclusion has happened and is happening. And I think the concept of intersectionality is very useful here. Adapted from Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term in 1989, and it has since become a very popular term or a very popular concept, particularly in diaspora Black feminism, where we need to consider when we're thinking about redressing injustices of the past, we need to consider not just the individual injustices that have been done to people, but the compounded injustices that are done when you have exclusions based on ethnicity, which we typically talk about when we're talking about decolonization, but other exclusions as well, such as class, gender, disability, and many others, sexuality, for example, being another. And for many individuals, these injustices intersect. These historical injustices, systemic injustices intersect. And so we end up with not just a monolithic view of what exclusion might look like or what injustice might look like, but an individual view where every individual has a different experience. And we need to consider those individual and different experiences for each person at an individual level. And then moving on to ontological violence, particularly in libraries and education, because the two are very closely linked. I think it's useful, although it is painful, it is useful to look at the legacy of violence that has been done in the past. So looking at three aspects of that, historically and currently, what we are dealing with is privileges of knowledge, where there are privileged knowledges that are foregrounded. So for example, here in the Southern African context, where the Western European, Eurocentric, colonial knowledges are privileged, where epistemologies are given relative higher value than local epistemologies and cosmologies. Knowledges of privilege, which perpetuate, so these Western worldviews like liberal humanism and enlightenment, which are perpetuated through the way that we teach, through the information that we give access to, etc. And then finally, rights of access, which in South Africa we have, historically, where people were excluded by law from certain places, like public libraries, like museums, universities, and how people are given rights to access certain spaces, even at the level of universities, for example, where one's school performance influences what you may study at university or even your access to a university itself. Then also looking at the idea that that libraries should be neutral spaces, politically neutral spaces, which is an idea that I've come across many times with my students who feel that the library should be a neutral space, and I disagree with that completely. That depoliticizing the library actually does exclude many voices, and very often tends to ignore the violences that have been done in the past. So libraries are political spaces. They need to be political spaces. They need to be politically engaged if we are to look at addressing injustice. And then finally, my particular area of research is very much around spectralizing the savage, which takes the marginalized population, historically, politically, economically marginalized population, and tends to look at it through a lens of Western liberal humanism, that kind of ghosts or mirrors uses the savage, the idea of the savage as a ghost or a mirror through many dynamics. One looking at the noble savage, taking the certain attributes that indigenous people may have and exploiting them, basically. Looking at the savage as a threat, the barbarians at the gate, seeing them as, you know, pushing them out, keeping them at a distance, not engaging with them because they are threatening to the exploitative power of the colony. And reification, finally, you know, taking their knowledges, taking their cosmologies, and turning them into Western or Eurocentric, adapting them into Western or erasing them by adapting them into Western knowledges, which Townes, I think, neatly sums up in this reductions of black bodies to extensions of Western man. And I think the term that he uses there, man, is also very important. Centralizing the male figure is something that has historically been done a lot, and ignoring female voices. So looking at how all of this can be addressed, possibly through both libraries and education, through collections, classification, display, and engagement. And I'll move on to those now. As 4 kind of core activities that a library would do, starting with collection, I mean, looking at our collections, and Stacey did allude to a lot of how, you know, we either have collections in our libraries that are not noticed, or selection, making sure that when we acquire resources into our collections, that we are giving priority to resources that have historically been ignored, and also aware of our privileges and how we privilege particular knowledges. Making sure that we proportionally amplify knowledge, marginalized knowledge, narratives through the collections that we build. And then obviously providing economic support by acquiring and paying for resources that are locally produced or that support equity in access to knowledge, that we are hopefully able to support and sustain those the producers of those resources better. Then classification, and Stacey alluded to this as well, speaking about subject headings and classification systems, which urgently require review. And I'm not going to go into a lot more detail about that because Stacey has already spoken about that. And we need more initiatives. We need, I think, something that IFLA can certainly be supporting, is looking at our classification systems and parallel classifications, allowing classifications to draw from classifications or micro classifications that may exist in particular areas. And the First Peoples taxonomies that Stacey showed us was a very good example of that. Centering the marginal and contextualizing. Look at how we are contextualizing works and narratives and resources that are coming from previously marginalized and currently marginalized spaces and peoples. And then display. Look at how we are putting forward these resources, foregrounding silenced voices, and also foregrounding the silences that exist, showing that there are gaps, acknowledging that there are gaps, and creating spaces for those gaps to be filled. Reducing opacity, we have to make sure that navigation to those resources is not opaque as libraries can very often be. Libraries can be very alienating places. They are structured around colonial systems. They are very often colonial type buildings that can be alienating and unwelcoming to many people, and we need to be aware of that and navigating around those resources, making it much easier. If we look at disability, for example, is a good example, I think, where making our spaces accessible to people with disabilities is something that that has come more to the foreground, and I think we should be dealing, excuse me, in the same way with accessibility around previously or historically marginalized voices and currently marginalized voices. And then finally, looking at how we engage with people, different modes of access, providing different channels of access. And the internet obviously being one of them. Stacey spoke about things like, she used a really nice term, indigitization, which is great. But also bearing in mind, in places like Africa, places like India, where there's gross inequity around the digital divide. So providing access through internet technology is not necessarily always the best answer. And very often those technologies are adopted and deployed in ways and modes that replicate power structures, exploitative power structures, and we need to be conscious and aware of that. Dialogue, obviously, speaking with and listening to people to find out, not just deciding that we know what is best. I mean, that is historically and systematically a mode of colonization in itself, is deciding what is best on behalf of somebody else. So dialogue enabling us to hear and listen to marginalized voices. The way we respond needs to be carefully considered. Translanguaging, I hope, speaks for itself. Awareness and advocacy, we certainly, as libraries, have a role to play when it comes to awareness and advocacy within our communities. Accommodation, making space to accommodate marginalized voices, and co-discovery, which I think is important. And underlying all of this, the management structures and ethos of our libraries need to be examined. Historically, and this may be very uncomfortable for some, historically our management structures are quite colonial in their very foundations. Decoloniality is uncomfortable, it is subversive, it is transgressive, and as managers and executives, we need to be prepared to deal with that subversion and that transgression. And we need to look at our own management structures carefully to see where we are perpetuating, not just in, tokenism, number of faces that we include, but also the way we manage people and the way we speak to people. So what are the implications of this for LIS teaching? A couple of ideas that I'm throwing out here. Two ways of looking at it. Firstly, bringing in critical perspectives and approaches, Marxian, feminist, post-humanist, and decolonial approaches to research and to teaching and to knowledge. That will hopefully stimulate more argument, more thinking, more critical thinking, particularly about how we provide access to knowledge, how we think about knowledge, how we classify knowledge. and then also an ethics of care, addressing the pain that comes with confronting coloniality. When we are dealing with marginalized voices, there are generational legacies of pain that we need to be aware exist. We need to be aware that when we speak about these issues, we are raising the specters of pain. And that means that we, in our pedagogy, we need to address the active, affective components of it. We need to address the emotions that are coming with this pain that we are bringing out in our teaching. What I call pedagogy of the heart. All of this leads us to areas of liminality, discomfort, decoding, de-disciplinarity. We need to decode our discipline of LIS. Library and Information Science needs to be re-looked at and decoded, de-disciplinarized in ways so that we can reconstruct it constructively to address ontological and epistemological inequities that we are typically perpetuating in the old style library. Sorry, I'm going backwards, not forwards there. And I propose that that means a fundamental reorganization of everything, of how we manage libraries, how we classify, how we engage, how we, even interactions at the circulation desk, and how we provide access to information. And then finally, I propose that what we need is open dialogue and a couple of processes that can hopefully lead to that, starting with an ethics of care, taking that as our starting point, which leads us to questioning our own positionality, even if we are representatives of people, if I happen to come from an indigenous community. What is my positionality with regards to a library? Am I adopting strategies and tactics that are actually colonial in nature? And of course, me as a white male individual speaking here about coloniality, I have my own baggage that I'm bringing to this. So, I need to question myself. How can I speak sensitively about topics like this? Providing multiple modes of access, looking at what modes of access might privilege certain types of knowledge. Through those multiple modes of access, taking on active listening and listening actively to our participants, which means we need to confront issues about the past, recognize pain, which leads us to our own discomfort, dealing with our own discomfort, which hopefully allows for disruption, allows us to disrupt the status quo, turning orthodoxy, the orthodoxies that we have, bringing about heterodoxy in the way that we operate, critical self-reflection, emerging from those heterodoxies, and that hopefully culminating in some kind of shared meaning where we are able to reframe the library, reorganize the library, and provide better and more equitable and more just ways of accessing information. So that's it, and then just very briefly some references to some of the sources that I've spoken about. That was, yeah, so that was whirlwind. As Stacey said, covered a whole lot of ground there, so if there are questions, which I'm pretty sure there will be, I'm quite happy to answer those.
Okay, so we have two questions in the Q&A. First from Lena. May I request that Richard shed light on what it means that libraries need to be politicized? Examples may help to bring clarity.
Hi, Lena. Great to see you here. Lena is was one of my students. So,
Oh, excellent.
yeah. Um, my feeling is that very often we have this feeling that libraries need to be politically neutral, that the library needs to be apolitical, that I feel that does injustices, because in saying that the library needs to be neutral or apolitical, we are actually silencing narratives that have been silenced. What I mean by that is, if we do not confront the injustices of the past, the painful histories, and to do that, we need to be political. We need to have a political perspective on them. And if we do not confront them, we are not going to be able to productively engage with historically and currently marginalized narratives. I hope that answers the question. I'm not saying that we have to well, I am saying we have to be political advocates. We have to be politically engaged to be able to share resources, to help our users to navigate to resources that are going to lead to better and more productive understanding. As libraries, we serve the communities that we serve the communities that we serve, and we need to be able to serve them in a productive and just way from a point of view of ethics of care. And if we are looking at ethics of care, we cannot afford to be apolitical. Lena, I hope that answers your question. University of Cape Town, you asked for examples. If the University of Cape Town were to take an apolitical stance and say, we're not going to get politically involved in decolonization, that would mean that our students would continue to come into the library, feel alienated, feel that all the knowledge that they are being led to and guided to is Western, is not representative of them. They don't see themselves in the library. They see themselves in an alienated space. So that is an example of what I mean.
Excellent. Thank you. So I have another question. I believe this is Helen from Kenya again, if I'm reading this correctly. It says, thank you for a highly educative presentation, Richard. My question, are there plans to have these perspectives adopted and practiced at the community and school library level for wider societal ripple effect?
Well, Helen, I would be enormously gratified if there were. I'm not, I'm not at all aware of any kind of program that exists at this point. Certainly, I think LIS educators are obligated to try to make sure that students are aware of this. It was something that when I was teaching in library leadership and management, I was trying to conscientize my students about, so that they could take it forth into school libraries or municipal libraries or academic libraries that they were working in. And I think it is really up to organizations like IFLA and the country organizations to try to drive this kind of thing. That is my sense. As far as I know, there are no programs as such, or there's no unified movement as such around this, but I'd be extremely gratified if there were.
Excellent. Well, yes, I think it is a very interesting concept. Okay, another question. We've actually got quite a few. Hello, my name is Danielle Marie Bitz. I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, Canada. I work in the iPortal at USAC. I'm interested in your discussion of pedagogy of the heart, not only for dealing with the pain of marginality, but also as a means of addressing settler guilt. And I'm wondering if there's more you'd like to say about it.
Oh, yes. That's pedagogy of the heart is indeed very useful, and something that I forgot to mention, because if we're looking at positionality from the point of view of the settler, so from my settler perspective as well, if I am teaching something around decoloniality, for example, ontological injustice, if I'm teaching or researching it, I have my own pain around that. I have my own guilt around that. And that is an affect that I bring to the classroom. That is something that makes me sensitive and makes me vulnerable to what I'm teaching. And that vulnerability, if I say to a student, if I communicate that to the students and saying, this is my vulnerability around this issue, it brings them to a sense of being able to feel that, their vulnerability is also valid, and that our shared vulnerability can lead us to better learning, not only of the broader context, the broader social context, but better learning of the content itself, because it makes that content relevant both for me and for the students. So yes, definitely, pedagogies of the heart is not just about looking at the heart of the students, but the heart of the teacher as well.
Can I, sorry, this is Stacey. I just want to follow up. Sorry, just from the perspective of LIS education, and I wonder if you can speak on one of the things I think is probably common across the world is the sort of the lack of Indigenous peoples in LIS education. And I know we can talk about the settler perspective, but what it is like for Indigenous LIS students to also be continually in not only libraries that are heavily colonial, but even in LIS education, which tend to even teach Indigenous perspectives from settlers. So I just wanted to know, I know this is an issue in Canada when we talk about LIS curriculum, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about how, again, when we talk about this is increasing Indigenous peoples in libraries and in archives and in museums as people actually doing that work themselves, and also as LIS professors.
Stacey, a very good question. I'm sure it's slightly different here in Southern Africa to the way it is in Canada, where obviously in Southern Africa we have a lot more opportunities, with Indigenous people being in the majority. We've got a lot more opportunities to make sure that we're able to educate Indigenous people, to empower them, to support them in taking places of leadership in LIS and also LIS education and research. Although we are far from where we need to be, we are certainly making progress in that area. But I think one of the problems we face, and that I've encountered in reading research from my Southern African colleagues and African colleagues and other colleagues in other countries such as India and Malaysia, for example, that there is still this kind of perception that the Eurocentric way is the best way, that we need to adopt Eurocentric or Western attitudes to LIS and LIS education. So I think there's a paradigm shift required from that perspective as well, that we need to have more faith and confidence in what we are able to do, and what are, taking ownership of our epistemologies and ontologies and saying these are valid, they need to be heard. The fact that I, as a white male, am here speaking from a Global South perspective is very revealing. I would far rather have some of my students or colleagues feeling that they are confident to speak on this topic. My black students or colleagues feeling that they are confident to speak on this topic rather than me. I think you do in Canada or New Zealand, there would be a different dynamic, because there you are dealing with minorities, and I have no answer there, unfortunately. I think advocacy is really our best ally there.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Stacy, for the question. I think that was important to be said. It was not lost on me as I was preparing my notes that we have a very white panel speaking on a topic where it would be where diversity is clearly a question and a concern. Okay, I'm going to move on to our next question. Since there is a digital divide, as you reminded us, what resources can we use instead of the internet to address decolonization in libraries?
Great. People are the best resource. Library personnel who are able to engage with people, empowering and enabling library personnel to engage with visitors, physical visitors to the library, in ways that stimulate decolonization. There are also low-tech options such as WhatsApp. Everybody has a smartphone, or almost everybody has a smartphone. It doesn't need to be high-tech. It doesn't need to, you don't need to be using drones to deliver books. Mobile libraries. There have been some initiatives in East Africa, for example, where small libraries have been set up in public laundries, or public spaces like public laundries, where people can come along. They bring their laundry along. While they're doing their laundry, they can have a chat or take out books or read, or have a reading circle, sit and do some handwork while that's happening, do some crocheting or something. The kids at the same time are being looked after, and then they leave the laundry with a couple of books. Something like that also introduces sharing of oral history, sharing of oral narratives at the same time, can be hugely productive. So it doesn't need to be high-tech, it doesn't need to be internet-based. People are the best resource, and conscientizing people, I think, is the best way to get that happening.
Okay, and we have one last question in the Q&A. Could you explain the meaning of translanguaging, please? Thank you.
Yeah, great. Good question, Anna. Something I'm certainly not an expert on. It is something that has come up in pedagogy and teaching. For example, in South Africa, where we have 11 official languages, students who come to the University of Cape Town are taught almost exclusively in English. And translanguaging is using different languages in the classroom or in teaching materials. So, for example, in a mathematics class, where the class is being taught in English, and particular terms that may be particularly abstract or difficult, the lecturer can ask the students in the class, how would you explain this in isiXhosa or Sesotho or one of the other languages that the students may be more familiar with? So it's kind of on the spot dual language or multi-medium multi-language teaching. Yeah, I'm not an expert on it. It's something I have yet to explore in any depth, but I hope that gives you an overview.
Thank you. And I've actually had one last question that came in on the chat from Despina, actually at IFLA HQ. Thank you, Richard, for this very interesting presentation. Which academic references would you recommend for the effective pedagogy? Do they come mostly from psychology?
No. Psychology in education. I would need to go hunting for them because I don't have them offhand, and I'm really bad with remembering names.
If it's a good question, if you've got something that you could send along after, then when we post the information, when we post things to the website, we can do a little follow-up. And
I am going to post something here in the chat, for example.
Perfect. Excellent.
There's a really nice one.
Oh, good. Excellent. Very good. Okay, I think we have covered all of the questions. Thank you, everybody who has, thank you to all of our attendees for a really engaged and engaged discussion and some really good questions. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Stacy, for your time and for some very informative presentations. And we will be posting the recording of this session on our IFLA website. It may take us a day or two to get it up there, but we'll send a note out on our social media once it's up. Thanks again, everybody. And I look forward to having you join. Oh, I had said that I would talk, I did say that I promised that I would talk about our next webinar. We have another webinar coming up next month, which is actually a replacement for the in-person session, our in-person hot topics session that we normally have at the conference. So that will be, actually, I have lost my notes on when that session will be, but again, when we send out the messaging about the recording of this session, we can also let you know when our hot topic session will be coming up. So thanks very much, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you at another session soon.